For me, I'm out of breath now. Oh, dear. For me, honestly, that's embarrassing, isn't it? For me, when I hear the word rest, I have a really positive reaction. I think, yes, that is something that I really want to do more of in my life. It's something that I think is important. It's something that I want to do more of. But it's also something that I feel like I actually find quite hard to do. When I do take the time to rest, I actually find myself getting really distracted, thinking about work quite a lot, all of those things. And I have been going on a bit of a journey of learning how to get better at resting, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But whatever your reaction to this word rest this morning, whether you feel that it's a positive thing and it's something that you have a really good rhythm of doing already, maybe it's something that feels completely alien or out of reach to you because of the circumstances of your life. Maybe it's something you feel guilty about when you try and do it. Or maybe it's something that actually feels quite difficult for a number of different reasons. Whatever your attitude to that word rest is, this morning we're going to be exploring the truth that all of us can enter a deeper type of rest that only God can give us. So we're going to think a bit about what that means and how we go about doing it. So this story about the Israelites missing out on entering the promised land is back near the beginning of the Bible. If you want to look it up later, you can find it in Deuteronomy 1 and 2 and Numbers 13 and 14. But I'm going to give you a very short overview of a bit of the context and then tell you a bit about the story. So God's chosen people, the Israelites, they were the people that he chose to reveal himself to the world through. They were liberated from slavery in Egypt by Moses. They walked through the Red Sea to the foot of Mount Sinai, where God gave them the 10 Commandments and 600 plus other laws, which they were to follow so that they could live in a way that was very different to the world around them. Now, note that one of these laws was to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And then after this, God's plan was to lead them into the land of Canaan, which we've also named the Promised Land, as it was the land that God had promised to give his people to rule over. But there was a little problem, and the problem was that this land of Canaan was currently occupied by people from other nations. And so the Israelites, they sent 12 spies to go into the land and to check it out. Firstly, to see if it was as amazing as God had said it was going to be. And secondly, to decide how they were going to go about possessing it as God had instructed them to. But when the spies came back, although they all said that the land was amazing, as God had said that it would be, only 2 of the 12, Joshua and Caleb, had the faith that they as a people would be able to take the land from the nations who were already possessing it. And so because of this, the Israelites chose to disobey God, to shrink back from taking what God had promised them. And they basically ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because of fear and because of their lack of faith and disobedience. And they did this until those who had doubted and those who had lacked faith had died, and a new generation could rise up and enter the land, or the rest that God had promised them. And so when we read in this passage in Hebrews 4 about those who didn't have faith or those who disobeyed, and therefore those who God declared shall never enter his rest, in verses 3 and 5, this is the situation that it's talking about. And this description of the promised land as God's rest is symbolic of the eternal rest that we enter via faith in and obedience to Jesus. A rest that, as it says in verses 7 and verse 10, is available to us today. I feel like the kids are doing well. Okay, we're doing good. So as the promised land is symbolic of the eternal rest that we have access to today in Jesus, we can learn a bit more about what this rest looks like by finding out a bit about the promised land. So in Exodus 3 verse 17 and Numbers 13 verse 27, the land of Canaan, the promised land, is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. And in Deuteronomy 8 verses 7 to 9, it's described as a land where you'll lack nothing. And to me, this describes a place where there's no stress or anxiety, no striving to achieve because all our needs are met in abundance. It's a place of God's blessing where there is the space to enjoy all the things that he's given us and to delight in those blessings. This is representative of what eternity with God will be like, but it also speaks of something that we're able to access now. A way of living where these things are possible. Something which God showed us how to access right back at the beginning of time during creation. We'll talk a bit about that later. And it's something that God really wants us to access today. Let's say it all together. We can enter God's rest today. We can enter God's rest today. Now, Hebrews 4 is full of warnings about not entering God's rest and about not being disobedient or lacking faith like the Israelites did. And based upon my understanding of the scriptures, I think there are 4 reasons for this, and therefore why God wants us to enter his rest today. And so the first reason then is God wants us to enter his rest today because his rest is a gift. God promised Canaan to the Israelites, and I believe that even though other nations were possessing the land at the time, God would have made a way for them to walk into it and take hold of it very easily if they just trusted in him and done what he'd asked them to do. It was a gift that he wanted them to enjoy. And although it tells us in Hebrews 4 verse 1 not to fall short of entering God's rest, I think this is about not trusting God enough that it is a gift, and therefore not having the faith to just go and take hold of it. God wants us to enter his rest. It's something he wants to give us. It is a gift for us to enjoy. We just need to take the steps to take hold of it. The second reason why I think God wants us to enter his rest is because God's rest demonstrates trust in him. In this passage, it talks repeatedly about disobedience and the negative impact of that. If we're obedient to God in taking the steps to enter his rest, despite how we may feel or what the world around us might say, it shows that we trust in him and we trust in the benefits of what he wants to give us above all else. Above ourselves, above the world and the people around us, and above the structures of the world. And that leads us on to point number 3, why I believe God wants us to enter his rest. Number 3, God's rest resists the structures of this world. We live in a world that is all about productivity. It's all about what we can contribute, busyness, consumerism. It's a world within which true rest, a rest where we have inner peace, where we're free from stress and anxiety, and where we truly get to enjoy all that God has given us, and where we don't feel like we have to strive, seems impossible. But when we actively enter God's rest, we resist those structures and what they're trying to do to us. When God gave the Israelites the 10 Commandments at the bottom of Mount Sinai, as I mentioned earlier, remembering the Sabbath day was one of them. The Israelites had just come out of slavery in Egypt, where they wouldn't have been able to observe the Sabbath, a practice which God demonstrated all the way back at creation. And so for them to practice practice Sabbath at that time would have firstly been a reminder of how God had freed them from that slavery. But secondly, it would also have been a reminder to not give into the way the world around them operated and to become oppressors like the Egyptians were. And then the reason number 4 why I believe God wants us to enter his rest is because God's rest helps bring his kingdom. Rest creates the space for us to enjoy being with God. And when we do this, we are therefore much more in tune with God's voice. We're much more relaxed, we're much more grateful, we're much more present, much more patient, and much more aware of God's love. And so we'll naturally be more able to operate in a way that helps us to partner with God in bringing his kingdom here on earth. God wants us to enter his rest so that we can be more effective in partnering with him to bring his kingdom to this broken world, as we sung about earlier. Okay, so we've covered what rest is and why God wants us to enter it today. The next question is how? How do we do that? The kids are going to help us very soon. Of course, we begin to enter God's rest by following and drawing close to Jesus. He is the one through whom we access the inner peace that is unique to the rest we find in him. In Matthew 11:28, it says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." I believe we need to create the space in our lives free from distractions where we can intentionally draw close to Jesus and can enter God's rest. And I believe that one of the best ways to do that is by actively practicing Sabbath, something that God himself did during creation. Verse 4 talks about this, about God resting from his works on the seventh day, the day after he created humans and therefore finished creating the world. Now, apart from the fact that God just spoke the earth into being, which doesn't sound like particularly hard work to me, he also is all-powerful, so I doubt he was tired on the seventh day and needed a nap. What do you think? I don't think he was. No, I think God stopped his work so that he could enjoy and delight in what he had created. It's like when I clean the house, which I'll admit I don't do that much, but when I clean the house and then I sit back and have a beer and I'm like, yes, look how shiny and clean my floors are, and then the dog comes along with their muddy paws. But that's what it's like. And God set aside a whole day for this, a whole day to just be and to enjoy his handiwork. And this rhythm of setting aside a whole day a week to stop, rest, and delight in God's presence and all he's given us is something that he instructed the Israelites to do, and is also something I've been actively trying to build into my life, as I think it has the potential to be completely life-changing. Now, we may not be under the Old Testament law here in 21st century Luton, but I think if practicing Sabbath was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. And as I said earlier, I believe that it is a gift that God gives us. It's a practice that demonstrates our trust in him. It's a resistance to the structures of this world. And it's a way we can more effectively partner with God in bringing his kingdom on earth. And if that's the case, then why wouldn't we want to do it? I've been actively trying to practice Sabbath now for probably about 2 to 3 months. And although I found it difficult and I'm starting to get used to it, it's actually began to become life-changing. For a big chunk of my life, I probably would have described myself as a workaholic. I've been doing youth ministry for about 20 years. I absolutely love it. I absolutely love spending time with young people and believe that it's a calling that God has put on my life. And for most of my 20s and 30s, I did youth work as my full-time job and then also would voluntarily do it in the evening and at the weekend. And some of this was because I genuinely love spending time with young people. I genuinely do. But when I reflect back on that period of my life now, deep down, I was also addicted to work and to doing because I was trying to earn God's love. And so that meant that for some of that time, that work came from a place of striving rather than a place of responding to God's love. And as I've gotten older, I've recognized this about myself and have tried to make some changes in how I spend my time. But it's only actually since I've started actively practicing Sabbath that I feel genuine peace about that decision. As I set aside one day a week to stop, to rest, and to delight in God and all that he's given me, I've noticed myself becoming less tired and grumpy, less anxious, less of a people pleaser, and having more joy, more gratitude, more contentment, and deeper relationships with God and others. I'm a firm believer that Sabbath is something that we all need. And I'll fully admit that when I first started doing it, I had absolutely no idea how to do it, and what to do with my time that wasn't just being productive, even if it wasn't my 9-to-5 job. I recommend John Mark Comer's book, Practicing the Way, and his Real of Life podcast. That's where I have gone for a lot of stuff that I've learned about it. And so, like I said at the start, whether your experience of or attitude to rest is something you feel positive about, something that feels completely out of reach or alien to you because of your circumstances, something you feel guilty about, or something you feel difficult for whatever reason, God wants us to enter his rest today. A rest that's for our soul as well as for our body, and creates a space for us to connect more deeply with him. And he's also gentle and gracious with us as we learn to do it. I do believe that he recognises how hard it can be to practice Sabbath in this world that we live in. I imagine it would have been difficult for those this letter of the Hebrews was sent to, but the benefits of it are huge. And to make it easier for us to do, I believe we as God's people are called to do it in community as well. And that means that where people cannot afford to take a complete day off of rest from work, which is a reality in the world that we live in today, we can financially support each other so that it is doable. Where people are single or live alone, we can provide companionship and people to celebrate with. And where people have young families or other caring responsibilities, we can share that supervision so that everyone gets to rest. Maybe this seems idealistic, but I think we're called to be different to the world, and that's a great way to do it. So to finish, children, you've gone again. I need that final point to be brought up. It's all right, don't worry. Yeah, don't worry. Fantastic. That final point, let's take it home to remember. We can all enter God's rest today. And so as we finish, I'm just going to encourage you to think for a few minutes about this question. What step can I take today or this week to help me enter God's rest? Maybe it's trying to Sabbath. Maybe that feels like a bit of a too big a step. Maybe it's spending one evening a week turning your phone off, or one evening a week where you don't watch TV. Or finding something that you really enjoy doing, something that brings you alive, that you can do with God. We all need somewhere to start, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with starting small.